How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylei Hobby Time. In celebration of May the 4th, which is Star Wars Day, I decided to make a nice big diorama to display my nice big Star Wars model kit. To begin this build, I made myself a base using a 4-foot by 2-foot sheet of plywood and some poplar planks. After double checking my spacing and placement, I took the planks outside, I trimmed them for a better fit. I then screwed it all together and I was left with a sturdy place to build the diorama on top of. I reached out to Woodland Scenics and I asked if they would be willing to sponsor this build, and they agreed. So huge shout out to Woodland Scenics for making this video possible. They sent me a care package of materials to use in this video, and a bunch of extra stuff for future projects as well. Links to everything will be in the description. After sanding the sides of the wooden base, I broke out some profile boards and I built up what is the border of the terrain of this diorama. I wanted to make a large flat spot for the Falcon to sit on, so I glued up a platform from leftover wood planks and a gesso board, which I glued together and clamped until they were dry. And speaking of the Millennium Falcon, let's jump over and assemble that before we get back to the terrain in a few minutes. As you can see, this is a very tall stack of plastic, but luckily after my last video, I'm not as intimidated to assemble perfect grade kits as I used to be. I started breaking everything out of the box and found the sprues that I was most afraid of, all of the tiny pipes and tubes. While these only make up a small amount of the total plastic, these sprues will definitely be taking up the majority of the assembly time. After removing all of the sprues from their bags, I laid them out on my table, and at this moment I fully realized the scale of the task at hand. I reminded myself this thing wasn't going to build itself, and I got cracking. Or snipping, rather. Snipping each piece from its sprue and attaching it one to the next. 679 times, to be exact. I mentioned those little pipes and tubes earlier, and the directions have you place them as you go from each section to the next, so having them spread out across the whole build made it feel less tedious. I genuinely had a lot of fun building this kit, which was actually a gift from my dad. He's probably been the biggest supporter of my hobby and this channel from day one, so I'd like to give a huge shout out to him for contributing the Millennium Falcon to this build. One thing I find funny about building Star Wars kits is that they were all originally kitbashed using other model kits, so putting together a model kit made up of other smaller model kits has always been kind of funny to me. I do really love looking at all of the details that went into this iconic ship. The kit comes with a closed ramp if you want to display it flying, but I went with the open one as it will be sitting on the ground in my display. After wrapping up all of the details on the underside of the ship, finishing up with the landing gear, I flipped it over and we were in the home stretch. At this point is when the largest concentration of pipes and tubes goes on, and while it is a bit tedious, is actually very satisfying as well. But even more satisfying is finally emptying a sprue that comes with originally over 60 pieces on it. The last thing to do was to glue the little metal vent covers in place, pop the back of the ship on, and we were ready to get back to building some terrain. I wasn't sure at this point how I wanted to orient the ship, but I threw down some tape around the edge of the board. This was to keep all the terrain inside the lines and save a lip for an acrylic lid, which will go on later. I used my hot wire foam cutter to begin shaping the profile of the landscape. I had a rough idea in my mind for what I wanted to do with the final shape of the terrain, but part of the fun of landscapes for me is the freedom to improvise and develop naturally as I go. And this terrain system makes it very easy to work that way. After the profile had been cut out, I began filling in the volume of the hill with some support panels. These are made from foam and are able to be cut with the same hot wire as the profile boards. The next thing to do was to create the shell of the terrain, and I was super excited to use these shaper sheets for that. These patented sheets are basically a felted material backed with a metal foil, so you can crinkle it up and create some really beautiful rock texture that holds its shape. I used a hot glue gun to hold it down, and I worked my way around the board, sculpting each section as I went. The whole thing took me about 30 minutes to cover. All you have to do to turn these sheets into a nice hard shell is to give them a coat of plaster. Woodland sells a special plaster specifically for this purpose, which is very thin and easy to brush on with a paintbrush. While the shaper sheets create a great shell, there are some unavoidable gaps between them. So to cover those up, I got out a roll of plaster cloth and I used it to patch up the remaining terrain. This will also create one more additional layer of strength for the shell. My favorite things about this terrain system are how quick it is to make such large terrain, how lightweight it stays, and that running wires for lights is extremely easy. All you have to do is make a cutout in the profile board, remove some sections of the foam supports once the shell is dry, and you're good to go. And speaking of wiring and lights, the model kit came with its own lights, but I wanted to connect it to the Just Plug system that Woodland sent me. Off camera, I slightly disassembled the battery pack that came with the ship, and I found the negative and positive terminals for the batteries, and I hardwired some extensions onto them. I had to do a little soldering just to get the Falcon connected to the Just Plug system, but once it was in the system, it was just a matter of plug and play. That's what I like about it. I wouldn't have to know a single thing about wiring or soldering to use this setup. The system also comes with the ability to dim or sequence your lights, which is pretty awesome. With the Falcon wired, it was time to kitbash the rest of the structures that will populate the landscape. I broke out my long bits box, which holds most of the larger bits, and I chose a few that looked promising. I also broke out my other bits box, which has all of the small bits and greeblies for detailing. I used the frame of a model railroad truss bridge and reshaped it to be the legs of an outpost tower. I wanted this build to be my own original creation rather than a named place in the Star Wars universe, so I came up with a little backstory for it that I'll explain later. I used an extra window from the Falcon kit to create a small observation window on the tower, and once the box at the top had 4 walls, I detailed it with bits from my bits box and some antennas from a patron of mine. For the door of the outpost, I used a cover plate from a weatherproof gang box, and I made a round door similar to the one shown in the first episode of Mandalorian Season 1. I used a cardboard roll to recess the door ever so slightly, and then I glued that in place. I also made a little ramp from styrene and a metal mesh, and after adding a few more details to the door, I cleaned up my workstation and it was time to add some lights. My favorite lights that I got from Woodland are probably their stick-on LEDs. I put one in this doorway, and it packs a real punch. I'm really happy with how that looks. I also threw some spotlights on the underside of the platform on the tower, which will cast some light onto the top of the Falcon, and then one more additional LED inside the little box at the top of the tower as well. With all of the structures wired up, it was time to move back to the landscape, which was now hopefully dry. It's dry. Next, it was time to integrate the structures into the terrain. The first step was to drill some holes where the wires could pass through, and like I mentioned before, once the shell is dry, you can begin to remove sections of the supports, and you can run wires without fear of collapse. I had to do a little trimming for my tower to match the slope of the hillside, but that was no problem. The other thing I wanted to do during this step was to add some plaster rocks, which I made off camera using Woodland's rock molds. I've used these molds for years, and I absolutely love them. Simply adding a few detailed rocks will go a long way for the final results. To patch up the large gap around the door, I made a Star Wars Hobbit hole using a shaper sheet, which I trimmed to fit the gap exactly. I then blended that new shaper sheet, the rocks, and the tower into the surrounding terrain using a nice thick terrain paste. After that, I sprinkled on some pebbles and some fine ballast everywhere on the base that looked like it needed it. And then I sealed all of that in place with some isopropyl alcohol and scenic cement. After that first layer of pebbles and sand had been glued in place, I sprinkled on one final layer of ballast, and then I made a little pathway of texture paint from the door to the landing platform. I couldn't really do anything else with the terrain till it was dry, so I set it aside to dry. Luckily, I had other things I could work on while that was drying, so I cleaned up my workstation, I got out the Falcon, and it was time to paint. And while I paint, I'd like to roll the names of all of my patrons and give them a huge shout out for their continued support of this channel. I loaded up a black primer, and after painting on the panel lines, I mixed up a gray that was pretty close to the gray that I saw in the reference photos. It came out looking a little cooler than I had anticipated, but I'll fix that with some following steps. I used a sepia wash to tint some of the panels with a warmer hue and begin establishing some weathering. After that was on, I broke out a chipping medium. The chipping effect will be essential to make sure that this ship looks the part. I used a brush to apply that to all of the panels with unique coloring, and once that had fully dried, I masked around each of those panels with some Tamiya masking tape. Once the ship had been masked off, I broke out the airbrush again and I applied a nice dark red and bluish gray to all the panels inside the yellow lines. When the painting was done, I removed the masking tape from the ship. I also removed the masking tape that I had applied earlier over all of the clear acrylic windows. The removal of masking tape is always incredibly satisfying. I then spread water over the colorful panels and I chipped away the paint using a stiff paintbrush, and the next step was to bring some contrast back to those panel lines. After applying the panel liner to all of the panel lines, I gave the whole thing a unifying coat of dust, and I was ready to move on. I don't know about you, but I was also ready to move on from that off-brand Star Wars music. I brought the base back, which had dried for a second time, and it was ready for some color. And I say this every time I spray paint inside, but please don't spray paint inside. At least not without tons of ventilation. I was going to prime it outside, but we had a few days of rain and snow last week, so I was forced to paint inside. I wanted these rocks to maintain an almost black look, so I only ever so slightly added a zenithal gray from above, and I gave a khaki to the pathway, and then I sprinkled on a fresh coat of green snow, which I sealed with more isopropyl alcohol and scenic cement. I then sprinkled on some yellowish snow, and I sealed that Luke Towan style. I did a tiny bit of subtle dry brushing on the rocks and the tower and the door, and then I set the base aside one final time to dry. And while it isn't super heavy, it is awkward to move alone. I knew I wanted some form of life on the hillside, so I painted up some sheep. I didn't have any alien sheep with me, so I just used normal sheep. And I'm not sure what planet in the Star Wars universe has sheep that's not Earth, but that's where this diorama takes place. Along with the sheep, I wanted to do a little bit of storytelling using this sign. This old outpost has been converted into an underground hipster coffee shop, so I used the word caf, which is the Star Wars equivalent of coffee. I cut that out of a little styrene sheet, and I glued it to the sign. The door on the side of the hill leads to a large underground bunker where the coffee shop is located. The little watchtower is the most desired place to sit while drinking coffee, so there's an additional fee for anyone who wants to sit up there. There's also a very long wait list. I wanted to light the sign using one of Woodland's floodlights, which I needed to drill a hole for, and I wasn't super careful. Got a little carried away with the drill. Created kind of a mess, but that's nothing that a little bit of flocking and glue can't mend. I ran the light through the base, and I made sure it was pointed in the right direction before I glued it into position. I then patched up the giant hole. I put one more of those LED stick-on lights on the ground behind the Falcon, and then I set the Millennium Falcon in place. I plugged all of the lights into the system and moved on to adding my sheep. After all of the sheep and a couple little birds were glued in place, I threw a wooden veneer on the side of the diorama, and I trimmed that down to match the profile of the edge. I then painted the sides of the diorama with black 4.0, including the side of the original wooden base at the bottom. The last step was to install the auxiliary switch underneath where the plexiglass will sit. So after drilling a hole for that, passing through the wires and connecting it to the rest of the system, I called it good. If you'd like to see this diorama in person, I'll be putting it on display at a few different places in Denver, starting with a coffee shop called Saper. Location details will be below. Before moving on to my final shots, please take a moment to appreciate this collection of beautiful otherworldly landscapes submitted by my patrons for last month's art challenge. A few of them have channels of their own, which you should definitely go check out and subscribe to. Links to them will be in the description as well. I'd like to say great job and thank you to all of the patrons who participated last month. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. A huge shout out to Woodland Scenics for sponsoring this video. Please go check them out once you're done here. And a huge shout out to all of my patrons. As always, you guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. Happy Star Wars Day. I'll see you next time.